Every engineering team in the world just got the ability to write 10 or even 100 times more code, but almost none of them are shipping 10 times the value. Why? Well, coding's not the bottleneck. It's everything else: the reviews, the testing, the rework, the waiting. Now that AI has flooded the system with more code than people can possibly review, you got a fork in the road. Either you figure out how to remove humans from the loop or watch somebody else do it first. Today, I'm joined by Francisco Trindade, a VP of product engineering at Braze. His path is one of the most interesting I've come across. He started in Brazil, went to school there, co-founded a company, finishing his master's degree. Then he spent 6 years at ThoughtWorks, consulting, shipping code across a number of different companies. Then he moved to Australia, co-founded a startup there, and then ended up in New York working at a couple other tech companies, and most recently joining Braze in 2021. While there, he's been promoted 3 times. He's now one of the product engineering leaders there. They're one of the fastest growing consumer engagement platforms in the world. They just hit 800 million ARR. He's also a big writer. He's a conference speaker, and he's working on a book. Francisco, good to have you here. Welcome to Tech Pod Talks.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for the nice intro, and very nice to be here.
Thanks again for coming on. You and I have known each other, a couple of years now? We met at a conference way back when, managed to stay in touch. I think you've got a cool story, and I've always appreciated your insights on what's going on in tech, working for a big SaaS company, certainly more recently with everything that's going on with AI. But why don't we just start with career story? So you've been an entrepreneur, you've been in consulting, now you're an executive at a public SaaS company. What's the thread that connects all of that?
It's interesting. I think the thread has always been, from the beginning, I think how to make teams work. I think like that's, and especially specifically like software teams. I think like I've always been interested in this idea of like kind of organizing work and making teams effective. I think, of course, when I started my first company back in college, I think that was maybe like not as clear, but I think even then, like as I started learning the profession and kind of like just like having effectively was like my first real job, what I kind of like tried to ended up doing was a lot of just like, how do I try to make this company effective? And then, and there's a story there is like, then I started to learn how to do it because, like I didn't know how to write software, and I was like now responsible for like writing software in a company of like organizing software. I ended up reading a lot of books. And at the time, a lot of books were published by ThoughtWorks, this consulting company that was like talking about like Agile and like TDD and like modeling and stuff like that. So after a few years of being an entrepreneur, I was just like, wow, I think my next step should be like to actually really learn how to do this, and I should apply to work at this company that I've been like reading about for like 3 years. And I was lucky to get this kind of job in London. I moved there, and that was like a great kind of like, I think that was my first kind of like long professional experience with people that were actually could like kind of like mentor me and stuff. And that was like where I kind of like I think I learned a lot. Like in that period, and ThoughtWorks was really about, I was an engineer, so I was like writing code and kind of like doing technical stuff, but a lot of kind of like the overlay of everything that we did was about like going to clients and helping them be effective at software development, both technically, but also process, kind of like and kind of thinking about that as a high level. So, and then that consolidated what I wanted to do, and that then kind of translated to like then another company and kind of like the leadership roles that I've had since.
Interesting to lead an org like you've got today versus trying to grow a startup. Compare and contrast that for me. What's it like early in your career when you're developing leadership skills, and then what have you learned along the way that's different, and what did you take away from those early experiences?
Yeah, I mean, a lot is in practice is different as things scale more, right? Like the day-to-day kind of becomes a bit different because, like back then I was like writing a lot of code, now like less so. And like, so there was like things like that. But I think being a founder was something that the thing interesting about being a founder is that you kind of wear multiple hats. So you are kind of you are kind of one day or maybe like 1 hour you're like writing code, the next hour you're like thinking about the strategy for the next 6 months and raising money. And like there was the big, especially at the beginning, like a lot of that is just like you kind of have a taste of like leadership at different levels, being even within one role. And then I think one thing that really kind of like I took from that, and I think I continue to take, is the idea of like ownership. I think like one thing that there's no better, one thing that a startup really teaches you is just like there's no one else to ask for help. A lot of times you're just like, oh, it's like you have to figure out. And that is something that I continue to take. I have continued to take like to all roles that I had, and it does help a lot, because I think a lot of like the challenges of leadership are really kind of like, there's this quote saying like leadership is making the invisible visible. It's just like, it's really like understanding a problem that is maybe opaque and kind of like quite not clear, and putting it into a structure that you can solve, like they can work against. And this is something that still I think happens like at Braze. We see a lot of like Braze of course is a much bigger company now, although we're still kind of like relatively small. We're like 350 engineers, I think, like so not like crazy big, but much bigger than like the companies like from the beginning of my career. And we still look, I think when people ask me like what are the traits that engineering leaders that succeed at Braze have, I think one of them is like the idea of like we have a lot of success with like past founders or people that were like CTOs of startups or like tech co-founders, because that's still a skill that's very valuable. It's just like kind of like how do you kind of like get these problems that are happening around you and like and can structure them and put it again a plan that we can align against and then work on.
Remind me, your master's, that was software engineering, is that right?
Yeah, a master's in computer science, and it was mostly it was an interesting. I mean, the beginning of my career it was a kind of like a peculiar experience, but like I studied computer engineering, and so that was like hardware and microelectronics, and that was kind of like the thing that I had a bit of software background, but not much. Like it was a lot of like assembly and C++, but I wasn't in any way like good at it or knew how to like do web applications or something like that, or application in general. So when we started this first company, there was like we decided to start this software company. And the reason we kind of decided was because we thought it was the only thing we could do that would kind of make us money without us having to put any money in it. So like we kind of like just like, I mean, this was before I think startups were a thing, at least like in Brazil. And the getting to my master's was a way for me to say, okay, I need to learn about, I'm now like trying to write software that's completely different from like the assembly code I wrote in like my graduate career, like learning. So I need to learn from someone, and then getting a master's in computer science was a way to just like get to know the people that could teach me and get to know like the kind of the concepts that I kind of like could start using like in this new field.
Man, you're giving me PTSD. I did electrical engineering, so yeah, I remember the microcontroller classes and C++. I wrote a lot of that. That was a long time ago. I don't know if anybody still writes C++, but yeah, you're giving me anxiety just talking about it right now. I'm curious, what'd you take away from the master's that has been useful throughout your career, either in the startups or nowadays?
I mean, I don't know if there was anything specific, but it was a lot of like what I mentioned before. I think that was my first like foray in computer science. Like there was a lot that I learned in my master's that I didn't like things that you say like are basic, like just like how does operating systems and like how do they work, and like what is like how do you write applications or like layers of software and stuff. So there's like things that like nowadays one would kind of like probably learn over like even like trying to become a learner by themselves, like self-taught on the internet. Like I didn't know that because one, it wasn't as easy to find material, but also like everything I was like being taught was like electrical engineering on kind of things related to that. So it was like really kind of like lower level concepts that I needed to kind of like rethink to actually write software.
Do you think the traditional comp sci degree path is still going to be a thing, or is that going to change?
Interesting question. I think there's a question like, are degrees still going to be a thing, or are they going to change, and are comp sci degrees be a thing? I think degrees, I don't know, maybe that's a I'm not completely sure about that, but I do think degrees is still going to continue, at least for like, even because of the inertia of like those exist and like the education models to exist. So like, yeah, I think they're useful in a lot of senses, like for like forming kind of people and just to study. The comp sci degree, I think it's still gonna exist. I think it's gonna be different, right? But I'm sure the comp sci degree from like 2025 is very different from the one I had in like 2005. So I think it has been changing, right? It's going to continue to change, adapt to the tools and what we need to learn to become like engineers or whatever, builders or whatever we're going to be, I think, in the next like decade or so. But I don't think ultimately we're not going to escape the fact that we're building software on top of hardware that needs to like run and scale and kind of like, and so someone needs to know that, right? And I think someone needs to understand that. So
Yeah, I always think, despite the fact that I've spent most of my career on the business side, having those early engineering experiences, either in school or right when I was out of school, now that you can code things with AI and write way more code way faster, the fact that I kind of understand what that code is doing and how it's organized and the systems approach to it, it's really useful. So yeah, I'm kind of with you. I would imagine that, maybe what you learn changes a little bit and how you learn is going to change a little bit, but degrees make sense for a bunch of reasons, or at least the education that you have to do to get the degree.
and I think the idea of like that's that principle of like you need to understand one layer below where you're working on, I think still is valid, right? And I think like you're gonna be a better prompt engineer or whatever, or builder or something, if you understand the code that's being generated to some extent and you can manage that. And I think there is a complexity of managing that code that as we talk about AI, we can talk about that, but I think those skills are definitely not kind of going away as like becoming useless anytime soon.
Yeah, that's a good take. I like that. Let's talk about entrepreneurship a little bit. So you founded a company in Australia, Your Grocer, if I'm not mistaken. Tell me a little bit about the story and what was that journey like?
So maybe just going back a bit, as I mentioned, like I joined this consulting company. I was like doing a lot of like work and I had a startup before. So I think within the consulting, I was also attracted to like work in the startups, and I was able to like within our process, I think like my consulting years, like to work with startups and some startups, and also like that was the time of lean startup. I don't know if you read the book or remember that kind of like the whole idea of process and stuff like that. So I was also like doing a lot of, at the end of my consulting years, I was doing a lot of kind of like innovation labs and helping companies kind of like do like lean startup kind of like cycles within like enterprise and stuff like that. So that kind of like made me like working on that field and working on those kind of types of like engagements. I always like was attracted, like I need to do a startup again. I was like learning a lot about like lean startup and how to do it and the process and things I didn't know in my first go of like my first company, which was, I wouldn't call it a startup, but it was like a business that we started that we knew kind of nothing about how to start a business. And I think like, so here was like 6-7 years later, I knew much more, and I was always the idea like I need to go do it again now with now kind of with some idea of what to do. And then I was in Australia. Australia is one of the characteristics of Australia. It has like this very, very high concentrated supermarket industry of like kind of like there's two brands that kind of own most of the market, like 80%. I think at the time it was like 80% of the market. And I met this my co-founder who was starting this business about like building kind of like a delivery system for like independent grocers, independent vendors, and trying to compete, I guess, providing a digital kind of like digital channel for like all these vendors that wouldn't have a website and have a like delivery stuff like that, and try to get them to compete with supermarkets. So that's what was the idea. And for me, as I liked the idea, I liked the kind of like the mission, but also like I wanted to do it again and really kind of like and do it kind of like from a better position. And And we did that. We kind of like, I was at the company for like 6 years. We kind of grew to, I think it kind of went well. The company still exists. Like I think we are now like 15 years later. I think like the company still is operating, but we kind of, we never were able to scale it to as much as we wanted, because like it's like you're trying to scale logistics business in like a low margin environment. So like we needed a lot of cash that we never were able to raise, I think, at that in Australia at that time. So it was like a great, but it was like a full experience of like being at this time being now a tech co-founder, raising money, kind of like building a team, and kind of like just like a much more like structured experience of a startup. That was like definitely it was an exciting time. It was a great time for my career. So I really enjoyed it.
Any lessons or big aha moments you kind of figured out back in those days that you still carry with you today?
Yeah, definitely. Many. I think one that I usually tell people is like the idea of like understanding the customer problem. Like we understanding your customer, like, and the way kind of like this was a beginning of our journey. Like we started this business, and we started this like started the business thinking about, okay, we're gonna sell to people like ourselves. So we were like, like 25, 30-year-old like single kind of professionals, and we say like we're gonna like be this we're gonna be the customers, right? We need this thing, and we like to cook. So we built the first version of a system. We had like a bunch of kind of a handful of clients, and like that kind of like started like repeating purchases, stuff like that. And we decided to do a series of interviews with them to kind of understand what's happening. And because they're all like we're in Melbourne, Australia, like they're all like in close by. It was all delivery, so it was like kind of within their neighborhoods. They weren't very far from us. So we booked like probably like 10, 15 interviews in their homes. Like, so we just like would go to people's home and just like have a chat. And we kind of followed this like jobs to be done method, which I still think is like was really kind of useful, like the jobs to be done interviews. But the interesting thing that when we started going to the houses, that we kind of like, I think the third or fourth interview, we just realized like all these people are moms with kids. There were kids. It was obvious, like, oh, there are kids everywhere, like every time we go. And it was such a, basic but obvious revelation to us, like that our target market was wrong, and we just like the assumption we had about the business. And of course, like this, I think I'm not saying this happens. That level of like misalignment doesn't happen, I think, on a corporate environment, because companies are just better at doing that than we were at the time. But there are types of misalignment like that happen, of like we just like, you don't really, I think it's still very common to have like breaks of communication between product design and engineering, that the engineer at the end of the line doesn't know exactly the problem they're trying to solve. And then you kind of like look at it and it's like, oh, we built the wrong thing because there was an obvious mismatch of like, or obvious misunderstanding. So this idea of like end-to-end understanding the problem, understanding the customer, that's something I still take nowadays, and still it's incredibly still a fresh concept nowadays than it was like kind of like 15 years ago.
Yeah, that one always cracks me up, because understanding your customer, it's so easy to say, it's kind of painfully obvious. It's also super easy to miss, and super easy to think you do, but you actually don't, and you didn't do the work to do it. And so, yeah, I've heard that lesson learned a bunch of times from a bunch of different people. So that one doesn't surprise me. Let's jump into leadership a little bit. So you've been a leader throughout your career in different ways: startups, consulting, now Braze. You've been promoted a few different times there. So pretty different environments. Tell me a little bit about your leadership style, and how has it evolved over the years and across the different types of places?
Yes, I think like there's ways that it has evolved and ways that it hasn't. I think as you kind of like grow through your career, and I think I actually like wrote about this in a blog post I think a few years ago. Is just like the more you kind of like progress, the more you have to have confidence in what you believe in, because the less there's going to be a structure around it. So like, if you're a manager in a team, that has, in a big company, like there's probably like a lot of rules that you have to follow, and you can kind of follow the rules, and there's someone that's going to lead you to do that. The more like you kind of progress, I think the more then like there's less advice, and you say like, oh, maybe if you're a manager, your manager is probably giving you a lot of like direction. If you're a senior manager, maybe a bit less. If you're a director, like now you maybe own kind of like a result that's like meaningful. If you get to like senior like director VP, and you're managing like a larger org at this point, like people are giving you direction, but like how things are going to be done is like kind of like up to you in a lot of senses. And I think if you don't have conviction, then you might end up creating this organization that's disjointed, right? Because like kind of like there's no real principles that are being applied consistently anywhere. Like, and I think that is, so being able to structure that kind of like in a way that people can understand and create like principles that can like people that the teams can follow, and things can work well. I think that's a challenge as you grow. So that has evolved, I think, and that's something I think I have learned, I think, throughout the process. But I think, like I found myself many times in my career just asking like, like why is the situation not different, and realizing, well, I'm the person who should be changing it. So it's like, so that is be that the conclusion. So I think that's like something to learn. At the same time, I think the job itself, the core of it, and I think going back to like the book, I think that's like the way I think about like the core of like leadership still the same, which is like you need to organize a group of people to deliver value as effectively as possible. And the tools might change with kind of like as you progress, but like the core of what you're trying to do is the same. And I think the thinking you have to use is kind of the same, which is like think about the end-to-end value, think about like effectiveness, think about like team output versus individual output. And I think one thing I've been trying to kind of talk more about the idea of like a manager being the micro CTO, right? It's just saying like you're kind of like, you are the owner of your team. Like the more you can behave like that, the more successful you're going to be, because the more you're going to feel empowered to like change the things that need to be changed and kind of like adapt things as they need to be adapted. So there are things that answer your question. I think some things evolved. I think some things remain the same. I think like throughout these years.
On that note, is there anything you used to believe early on that you realized either was totally wrong or you just decided to abandon?
I think something I used to believe is I think there's like things that I've definitely applied much more nuance to it. Like I think I'm I don't know, you being an engineer, if you felt that, I feel like I like to things to be very structured. And so I think engineering has, studying like engineering, I think gives you that structure of saying, okay, everything is a formula, everything is a number, everything can be like, there's like mathematical kind of like explanations for everything. And that structure, when you put that to a position where you're effectively like leading people and like that have their own beliefs and their own kind of ways of thinking about that becomes something you have to adapt. And I think so a lot of maybe like, not that I completely kind of like have completely changed, but I think what I had to like learn a lot and I think adapt a lot is just the idea of like, how do you provide the right amount or the right amount of guidance and direction, but like still kind of like not expecting everything to be perfect, because nothing is ever going to be perfect, right? Like and kind of like being able to control that. I think the other thing that maybe like the second thing I would say, and this is maybe like a bigger lesson I learned, I think, is that you really have to there's a cost of like energy of doing things, and the more you try to do, the less effective you're going to be at it, to a point that you become ineffective, right? And I think there is something that has happened in my career, is like being in positions where like, you solve a few problems and people think you can solve every problem. They say, well, maybe like solve all the 10 problems, and you want to help. So you say, well, in my case, I'll try to tackle everything. But then at some point you just like becoming effective at all of that, and kind of like you risk like you just like it doesn't work, right? And I think that's something. So trying to one, just like maybe like summarizing, I think trying one to kind of like understand how strongly you should advocate for things, and try to create a principle things that kind of like accept the kind of like the kind of like the nuance of like leading a group of people, or like the kind of like challenges that are going to come from that, and the difference of opinions that are going to come from that, but also like limiting the amount that you want like tackle at each time, so that doesn't become like you don't like become ineffective in the process, and kind of like just like risk it all.
Yeah, if you're focused on everything, you're focused on nothing, right? Speaking about leadership some more, I know you've done a bunch of writing. One of your pieces I caught, I'm going to quote, engineering leadership is managing the systems in the team to make people within it successful instead of the other way around. That's pretty interesting. I wonder if you could explain that, and maybe if you have any examples to go along with it.
Yes. So I think like that is I can definitely explain, and definitely plenty of examples. I think one of the principles of team leadership, I think that to the example, to the topic from before, I think are simple at face value, but not kind of like simple in practice, is like you're managing a team. So the result of the team is the thing that you're responsible for. And of course, the team is composed of individuals, and they all have to succeed. And I think there are like people that have aspirations, and they need to be kind of like, you need to like take that into consideration. But I think there is like two ways to approach engineering leadership, or like team leadership in general. Is that like you think about the team as the unit that you have to make effective, and then you adapt that to the people that you have, and that is, I think, one, the easiest way, and I think the most effective way. The other way is that you think about the people first and try to match what they want to do within the team that you have, and what aspiration they have, and that becomes like a complex puzzle to manage. And I think the other kind of like part of that most people, I think, take for granted, and is that like as a leader, you get a lot of freedom by delivering results. So like it's kind of like what I tell the managers that I work with today is just like the way for you to have like no one paying attention to what you're doing is like you just deliver the results that we ask you to deliver, because that is the main goal, right? Like, and then if you do that, then you gain a lot of like freedom that you can offer to the people that you manage, because you can say, well, you can run more of your own show because you're delivering what needs to be delivered. And on the other hand, if you fail to deliver results, then you get a lot of scrutiny in what you're doing, and you're probably going to get a lot of opinions about how you manage your team, and that creates like constraints that are going to be on you as a manager or as a leader, but also going to be on the team, because now they're going to be under like some kind of like some heavy constraints. So that's why I think about like when you're managing a team, you like really should be thinking about the system, or maybe like how the team works, and that making the team successful will make the people within it successful, because one, they're going to have more opportunities, of course, because they have more freedom, but also because as you deliver results, like the more you deliver, the more challenges are going to be given to you as a team. So there's more opportunities for people, and so that becomes like a virtuous cycle. The other way around, you kind of end up like more easy end up with blockers on your path.
Yeah, well, one of the common things you hear is, you create the roles and then figure out who fits in them, not the other way around. So to me, this sounds like an extension of that. I like how you think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there are plenty of examples of that, where like I have an example that happened like in the past, I think, which is there was a particular engineer in a past company that they were like brilliant, but in with pauses in between. They were brilliant for like they had like moments of really brilliance that would deliver things that like nobody believed that could be possible, but they weren't great at just delivering the normal like work. Like they just like were like they would get distracted. They were like just like struggle to kind of like follow the team process and stuff like that. But that was and that was a challenge. Like that in a team is a challenge, right? Because you kind of like, how do you kind of manage those things, and how do you adapt this the kind of like the work of this person to that. But the situation was that because that team was doing so well, like, and because like effectively the leadership within the company trusted me to manage it, like I could manage the situation however I wanted. So I could, and effectively what we did was like we kind of had some level of like an agreement of like where they could participate and how they would participate, but also I would provide more opportunities that were like kind of like more shaped the way that they wanted to, that they would like work well, which were like kind of like long, like moonshots of things that we kind of wanted to do, but maybe weren't sure to do. And this person would be like, doing that. But I only could do that because I had Slack on, kind of like I wasn't thinking about like, how many story points each engineer delivers. And I think like the team and that kind of like, because the team was working and the team was succeeding, like everyone kind of respected that, and they understood the contribution of this person, because they would every once in a while like do things that were like really kind of like will help a lot. So, but that is an example of a situation that wouldn't exist if I was being like micromanaged, or if like there was like micromanaged by like my manager, right? And that can only exist because that space was created. I think then the other situation also like have many examples of like managers that will be very, I think we have like sometimes like we talk about patterns of that, like within leadership, of like you have managers that are very well regarded by the reports because they effectively are like listening and trying to provide exactly what the reports are asking for, and trying to like defend them as much as possible and protect as much as possible. But then because they create a ineffective environment around that, like it doesn't work. So you kind of have this like, it's almost like once we look at like looking at like kind of like the effectiveness of a leader, like having results that are overly positive, like from like a bottom up kind of like perspective, combined with like results that are not very positive from a delivery perspective, like it's almost like a pattern of like just saying this happens kind of every once in a while, and it's like, and it points to this kind of individually focused perspective on management, right? Like that kind of like might create ineffective teams at the end.
I'm curious, the person you were talking about, how did it work out? Were able to retain them and make them productive and
still retained, still productive, and still kind of like the same way that kind of like they were before? And the thing is, and that is like, this is actually something it's fresh in my mind because I'm writing, like I wrote in the book, but like when I started my career, like, and it was like a ThoughtWorks, I was like, this was like the heyday of agile transformations, right? So a lot of companies are going from like this kind of like most model waterfall, more structured way of like working, where like people are like working on requirements and stuff like that, to like this more like agile environments where like we're like more social and you have to collaborate more and you had to like be there and talk to the product manager and stakeholders, and there was like much more like activity in that sense. And there was a pattern that I saw of like there was a lot of like very technical people that were essential for teams that would now struggle because they just weren't good at dealing with stakeholders. Like that was like not their skill. Their skill was like to write the best code that the team had, and had like the technical insight, and they would end up like struggling because they were being put in the system that was like putting them into boxes of saying like, okay, you have to be like this to be successful, right? And I think I always found strange because like we would go to clients and be like, oh, this person is clearly the most technical person we have, and we like they are essential for this project to work, but they are being like put to the side because they don't have like they're not so eloquent. Just like this is not the right decision, right? And I think that's like a challenge of like not managing the system. I think if you manage a team as a team and as a group of people that all have different skills and strengths, like then your job as a manager as a leader is to figure out how do you fit these pieces into a cohesive team that makes sense, right? Like, and that means you might have to allow some people not to do parts of the job and get them to, and cover for them, and but get other people and kind of like and kind of match that so that becomes effective. And because people are different, the job is always different, which I think is the interesting part of leadership, right? It's just like you can stay in the same job for 10 years and the job is going to be different every year, right? Because just the people around you, the context and the challenge is different every time.
You mentioned Agile, and I want to use that to shift into the AI conversation. I've got some other questions around AI, but what do you think happens with Agile? Is it here to stay? Does it change? What's your feel on that?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you think what has happened with Agile. I think like Agile, I mean, I used Agile to refer to something in the past because I think like we have overall in the industry like let go of it in some sense. I think we all do kind of like follow some iterative process, to some extent in a lot of like companies and most companies, and so we work on the principles of that. But I think I avoid using the term agile as something that happens currently because I think it creates reactions that I think are not ideal, because a lot of people were put into like these agile transformations that were like just not successful. Anyway, but I digress. So I think like if you talk about like what's going to happen to AI with what we have right now, I think this is the multi-million-dollar question to begin with. So I'm not saying I have the answers to that, but I do think that the principles remain. The principles is like there's a team, and this team might be smaller, might be larger, but this team needs to deliver value, and value is software running in production somewhere, like to deliver some value. So that still exists. So I think the idea that you have to understand the customer, you have to understand kind of like the goal, you have to understand the end to end, you have to get these people to collaborate. I think that's still gonna be a situation. I think in some extent, what this situation, this AI kind of revolution is bringing is a lot of the principles that existed in these agile transformations, because you're kind of like what AI is kind of like making very obvious now is that coding is not a bottleneck of software. And that was a principle that Agile was built upon. The idea of like the coding is not the bottleneck of software, even when it was like manually kind of like created. So I think a lot of those principles are back, and you can see with things like, there are like even practices that are kind of becoming, there's like people are talking more about planning together, which is something that existed like more in Agile. The people are talking about like writing more specs to kind of make sure the code works and you can guarantee it, which is again like there was like TDD and all the stuff that came from the Agile like kind of like movement. So, and that's because the principles are still the same. The principles are still out there. You need to deliver value through software, and that hasn't changed. Now the coding part has been reduced, which I think is creating the question like where the bottleneck's going to be. And I think we're seeing different things happening in terms of like, product design maybe sometimes being a bottleneck, but also like there is this kind of like sometimes expansion of like coding of like people trying to do a lot because they can do a lot now, but that becoming distracting through the ultimate goal that you're trying to deliver. And how to adapt to that, I think, is the big question. I think what companies need to do. But like my maybe like kind of perspectives are like what software engineers were doing before and are doing now hasn't changed, or shouldn't have changed. And that was to deliver value through software. And that's something that we're still going to need to continue doing.
Yeah, that's a good take. I like that. So if coding isn't the bottleneck, super easy to generate tons of code now. I know you wrote a piece recently where you talked about this. What is the bottleneck? What's broken that needs to change?
Yeah, I think the obvious bottleneck that's happening is like, now everyone's like, what's we're going to do with code reviews, right? Which is, I think now the question is like, can we get rid of code reviews at some point? Because we trust agents to write code consistently well, and we have systems to prevent them from going wrong, which I think is very likely and probably what most startups are doing right now. If you're starting a company now, you're probably like not even reviewing code, like you just write because you're trying to move fast. And I think, and you also hear from like, if you look at like larger companies that are trying to do that, I think in some extent. I think the challenge becomes like really for like, I think for the startups, like can you maintain that at scale, right? Like it's easy to write a bunch of stuff if you have like 5 agents running in a greenfield project. What if you have 100 engineers and you have each engineer has 5 agents running, now it's 500 agents, and the code base is now 2 million lines of code? Like, how do you maintain coherence on that code base and just like quality as you grow? And I think that's still going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a software engineering challenge that we're going to have to figure out. And then the other side of this coin is for companies that exist like that are running like revenue generating kind of like systems that if they break, they cause revenue issues. How do you create kind of like structure around your code in a way that you can provide more freedom to agents? And can you do that? And I think that is an interesting question, because I think in the attempt to do that, it's a long-term strategy in engineering. And if you invest a lot of that and you probably don't get it, maybe that investment is not the best investment to make. So there is a bit of a principle. The reason I wrote that piece, because I do think there is like a interesting like moment where like companies need to like have a vision of what's going to happen in a strategy, and if they don't, there might be this low company amongst like much faster companies moving in the right direction like in a few years, and that's like not the place you want to be, of course.
What do you think about the role of a software developer? Say everybody's using agents now and it's pretty easy to produce code. So what if your job is still deliver value, get software into production? What's the job look like? What does a senior engineer do, and what does that mean for how you hire them and motivate them and assess them and reward them?
Yeah, I think like it's a good question as well. Like I think like, I mean, one rewards. I think a lot of companies now, maybe it's like I would probably say that's at least the Aspire standard is like thinking about impact as like the reward mechanism of like how much an impact is something that's an approximation of value. So I think that continues. I think there's gonna be some recalibration of what that means, because I think a lot of companies have heuristics that match impact to kind of like how much code they're like offer to like outcome to output in some sense, and those heuristics probably are gone at this point. So how to recalibrate that's going to be an interesting challenge, I think, for companies like this year. But this essence of it continues. I think the job itself, I think it depends. Like to some level, I think to a lot of levels, the abstraction is going to go up. Probably you're prompting and you kind of like are like thinking about kind of like more like the requirements and kind of like how to deliver value. And I think there is going to be some level of convergence of roles of like, the engineer can do some design and the designer can maybe write some code, that the product. So all of that they can converge more, which I think, again, like I think is positive, because you're converging, there's always converging towards delivering value, which is great. I just think there's still going to be a lot of software like considerations, like in the sense of, at least for the not foreseeable future, but at least for like the short term, I think like of like, it is how do you run like hundreds and thousands of agents writing code at the same time, and what kind of testing do you need, and what kind of release process do you need, and what kind of review do you need, and how do you organize technical architecture, and all of those things are engineering problems that are unsolved now. So I think like that's not going to stop, at least for like as far as we can see in the future, which I don't know, maybe it's not that long, but I think it's probably going to be at least a few years until that we kind of evolve on that, and I think become much better. But it's at some point, I think, like you cannot think about software as a static thing as well. Like it's not like you write like a piece of code and it's there forever. It's like the challenge of software and the challenge, the essential complexity of software, which is like, since like Fred Brooks wrote the book, is like software keeps changing, and I think, and that's going to keep being a problem. So someone or something, so it's going to be like someone or something that someone wrote the rules for, is going to have to manage that complexity and keep that coherence. And there's a point where you need some level of like intervention to that to kind of decide what to do, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about AI for another couple hours, but to wrap up here, tell me, is there a piece of advice you've gotten that's really just stuck with you and maybe you even find yourself doling out from time to time?
Yeah, for sure. I think one that's relevant nowadays is since to get some AI into it. I once went to when I was early in my career, I didn't know what I want to do, like most people don't, and I went to this like talk that the speaker said like something that stuck with me was the idea of like careers that make sense looking forward, that make sense looking backwards. So of saying like you don't know, and their perspective is like you don't know what job's going to exist in 5 years. So what's the point of like trying to say you're going to be something 5 years? Like what you should do is like decide what you want to do now, do that as best you can, and then like the accumulation of your experience is going to make you unique in the future, right? And then that position is going to make sense for you because you have all these experiences that you chose to have throughout your career. And I think right now that's very relevant because like people are talking about what's going to be the role of the software engineer. Do I do this or not? Like I think do the best what you can now and learn throughout the process, and that there's going to be a new role, the existing role, a new role, some different version of this role is going to exist in the future. And the more you can like target yourself or like learn throughout the process, the more you're gonna like do better, the best you're gonna do at that.
Yeah, you know what? I love that because one of the things, I don't know if I ever got this advice, but eventually I realized this, and now it's advice that I give to folks that are earlier in their career, which is college kids are guilty of this, especially the ones that are high performers and, they think they've got to have their whole career mapped out and they're so anxious and worried about that first job and picking the right one. And I'm like, don't worry, like go try something. You can pivot along the way. And medicine and law maybe are the two exceptions to that. But other than that, don't worry about it. I studied
Yeah,
engineering and pivoted pretty early in my career, and there's a million stories like that. But I never connected it to what you just said, which is what's going on now. And yeah, careers and jobs are going to be way different.
exactly. And I think like I don't know if it's maybe it's a hot take. I don't know how much of a hot take it is, but like there's a lot of this kind of talk about like, oh, the junior engineers, they are doomed. And I'm thinking like when I was a junior engineer, the technology was so there, like the amount of revolutions I have gone through my career, of course, like this is a big one, but it's just like in the beginning of career we would spend like a week of 6 people trying to build a build server so we could like commit code, right? Like that was like hundreds of thousands of dollars investment. Like that is how much I'm involved to then, and we had to learn, and a lot of people had to learn in this period. Like I think junior engineers are going to learn and they're going to be fine doing whatever they need to do in like 5-10 years because that's what we all do, right?
Yeah, the advice I like to give is just like go build something, a company, a product, a software tool. Just get comfortable with being creative and figuring out stuff that you don't know how to do. And of course, there's communication is helpful. And if you can figure out how to sell something at some point in your life, that'll probably serve you well. But yeah, great point about what's going on with AI. Francisco, appreciate you, man. Hey, to wrap up, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
The best place now, I'm like on LinkedIn, probably like you can find me there and like connect, and that's a good way to like keep in touch and kind of like with things that I'm doing. But also I have like my blog and kind of where I publish a lot of is like on Medium, so it's at Francisco MT, and there you can find other things I write. And as I in the near future get this book ready and out, I think that's where like things are gonna the news are gonna be. So be the best place.
All right, man. We'll put that stuff in the show notes. This was fun. I appreciate you joining me. It was good to catch up and get your hot takes on everything.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Steven.
All right. Thanks, Francisco.